Canadians have been able to trust in the fundamental integrity of their social institutions for most of our 150-year history. And so the default assumption has been, well, people generally know what they're doing if they're leading us, and they're not leading us down the garden path. And the problem with Bill 67 and getting people to understand it is that they also have to simultaneously swallow the fact that our fundamental institutions, educational and political, have become so compromised and so co-opted by derivatives of a narrative so radical that even most Democrats on the left reject it out hand. Well, who's going to believe that? It's a lot easier to think that the four of us are, right-wing conspiracy theorists and that this is all nonsense. And in fact, it's easier for me to believe that sometimes than to believe the alternative. But I read this bill and I know what equity means, and I know its ideological derivatives and the underlying idea system. And
I've said before that our biggest obstacle is disbelief. People don't believe it. People don't believe that what we're describing could actually be true. It's just so far out of the zone of what they consider to be normal life, normal civilized life in this country, that it's very hard to take in unless you've sort of seen it for yourself in front of your own eyes over and over again, and you're forced to admit that it's actually happening.
So, media research is one of the things I do, and this isn't my work, but it's a guy named Zach Goldberg. He's out of Georgia State University. Anyway, Zach looked at what was going on in mainstream media related to coverage of race. And race, the word equity, the word anti-racism, it's gone up by 1,000% in the last, he was marking from 2013 and 2014. And here's the interesting thing. When you look at other sociological data, during that time, racial tensions in terms of other societal measures were going down. The United States had a black president, and so it was actually getting better. But if you read the news, particularly the more left-leaning, so he had looked at New York Times, he looked at the Washington Post, it was saying exactly the opposite. And people were being convinced. And in particular, he found, this is Goldberg's work again, he found that those people who were of a liberal persuasion were even more convinced that we were going to hell in a handbasket in terms of racial division.
Yeah, well, his work pointed out that as these press institutions started to hire recent graduates from universities who had been indoctrinated into this theory, they started using that language in their articles, and that seeped into the popular culture. So it wasn't that racism became worse in the domain of real interactions and then people noticed. It was that the journalists educated at high-level institutions who were hired by these hypothetical news sources insisted that this was the case and started to introduce that doctrine into the entire culture. And with this bill, for example, being a late consequence of that.
Well, we can actually transpose that. We can transpose that onto universities. So there was a guy, Paul Kelstead, out of Texas A&M, and what he showed was that the news media drive the perceptions in the culture, and then the culture kind of becomes what the news media said it was. Well, that's going to happen with these kind of bills as we pass them provincially. You'll have students who never thought about racial disharmony, who suddenly that becomes their only thing on their mind, and it will just cascade.
The other thing we might want to point out is that this kind of propaganda is really easy for incompetent people to teach, because you only have to master about two principles. So the first principle is, well, let's say there's nothing that motivates human beings and their institutions except the naked desire for power. So, okay. And then the second thing is that people should be categorized by group, and that doesn't require much differentiated thinking, because who cares about all those pesky individuals? And then the third thing you have to accept is that the world is best construed as an eternal war between oppressors and those who are victimized and exploited by them, by every institution. Now, you master those three things, you can teach everything you need to teach about diversity, inclusivity, equity, all of that.
The fourth thing is you've got to keep moving the goalposts, because for revolutionaries, the revolution can never end. I mean, they're not in it for it to end. They're in it to keep it going, because that's what's exciting for them. So, in other words, what was racist 50 years ago or 20 years ago would be a racist action, or somebody saying a terrible thing, or the N-word, or whatever it is. Now since that's diminished, now they've moved the goalposts so that it's unconscious. Yeah, you're not seeing. Oh, it doesn't matter if you don't see the racism. Then there's these microaggressions, and there's what's in your mind. It used to be an action. You used to have to behave in a racist way. Now they're telling you what's in your mind, and so you don't have to act at all. You can be a racist.
It's even worse than that. It's worse than that, Barb, as you pointed out before, because you don't even have to be prejudiced. You just have to be perceived as prejudiced by someone. That's it. And that actually, because there's no you, there's no soul there, there's no individual there. All you are is the consequences of your actions. And you think, could you come up with a principle of justice more appalling than that? Is that none of us are going to be judged again on our intentions, but only by the worst consequences of our actions? Unbelievable.